Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Holy Sparks podcast. Saul K here, super excited and grateful for yet another quality guest. And without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce and edify the woman properly. Rabbi Lauren Tuchman is a sought after speaker, spiritual leader, and educator who was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary, JTS, in 2018. She teaches, consults, and provides workshops and trainings to individuals and organizations within and outside of the Jewish community on a variety of matters pertinent to disability access and inclusion. She was named to the Jewish Week's 36 Under 36 for her innovative teaching and leadership concerning inclusion of Jews with disabilities in all aspects of Jewish life. In 2017, she delivered an ELI Talk entitled "We All Were at Sinai, the Transformative Power of Inclusive Torah." She is the world's first ordained blind woman rabbi. Rabbi Lauren, welcome to the Holy Sparks podcast.
Thank you so much, Saul. It's a bracha to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for making some time this morning. I know you're very busy, and so it's interesting. We've been in a 2-year Jewish meditation teachers training program, and I didn't even know she was a rabbi until the very, very, very end. So we're going to tell that story at the end. But for now, by way of letting people get to know you, tell us where and how you grew up, specifically oriented with the Jewish lens.
So with the Jewish lens, I actually did not grow up Jewishly affiliated. My family is interfaith, and so there was Judaism in my home, but we weren't connected to a shul or a community directly. And so I had to take Judaism on my own, which meant that I felt both very lost in Jewish community a lot because especially in my early 20s when I was becoming more religiously observant, and desperately wanting to fit in as you do in those times, at that age, I was like, I must learn all this stuff and I must fit in. And then there's the other part of me that's like, it's such a blessing to be able to have to make this your own because nobody gave it to me, right? In that way, right? There's nothing that I took for granted. And I feel a great responsibility in that regard to really honor the success and opportunity that I had to come into a very, very vibrant, robust Jewish identity as an adult on maybe not my own terms, but very much like as an autonomous adult making that choice and really cleaving to the Jewish people in that way. And I think that there's something really beautiful about that because I had to constantly learn, grow, question, and find my way in an often very inaccessible space, which had a lot of challenges as well. And a lot of times those challenges were things that I didn't feel like, especially in the beginning, I had a lot of space to talk about. And especially as I've really come into my own as a rabbi and professional, I feel it's actually really important to be very authentic with what people's experiences are, what my experience has been, because it really, I think, both allows for connection and it also allows for truth telling in a really beautiful way because it allows us to make our community better. And that's, I think, one of our goals is to try to make things better. Often, I think we don't like to face the things that are hard because we think it means that we're, you know, somehow unable to ever change. But actually, it's quite the opposite. It's like when we can be with what is, and to bring in the mindfulness piece, which we'll, I am sure, talk about later, to be with what is, actually makes it so much easier to move in a much more inclusive, accessible direction.
Okay, all right, hang on. She went all the way into the deep end of the pool, skipped the administrative narrative, went straight to the good stuff. But I got to rewind the tape a little bit because I always like people to understand the timeline, right? Because everyone, when they're listening to this, they're thinking about their own Jewish timeline and their story and
Yeah,
how
totally.
things map on. So, if you don't mind, I'm just going to rewind a little bit. And so, take me from around high school. Was there a Jewish day school or public school, and at what point in your, collegiate experience were you more Jewishly connected? Just walk us through that timeline.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Sometimes it's very helpful for me to have that instruction because I am often, wont to go to the deep end. So it's good to rewind. Um, yeah, so when I went to a public high school. I went to a very Jewish public high school. And so I connected with a lot of peers that way and really kind of had the youth group experience, kind of like on the outskirts of the youth group experience, but I kind of like dipped in a little bit. And then when I was in college, I went to a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania called Dickinson College. And at the time that I was a student there, we had a very small but mighty Jewish community. I actually feel extraordinarily grateful that when I was a student there, a lot of the folks that I was hanging out with at Hillel and a lot of the folks that I was hanging out with in the religion department ended up becoming Jewish professionals. So, for a very small college in central Pennsylvania, we produced a good number of Jewish professionals. And that was really how I got started. Like, I just kind of dove into Hillel. And one of my closest friends to this day is somebody that I met at Hillel and is now a Reform rabbi. So, it's really lovely to have had that 20 plus year long friendship. And it really started as college students really trying to make the best of a small Hillel. And in some ways, when you have a small Hillel, and at that time we didn't have rabbinic support in an ongoing way. That's changed now at my alma mater. But when I was a student there was not a rabbi on staff. And so we would have students come in. And of course, I didn't really understand. I now understand as somebody who went to rabbinical school that rabbinical students have internships. But when I was in college, I was just like, these people are coming in, they're hanging out with us, and then they're leaving. So it meant that we kind of had to create our own Jewish community and our own Jewish life. And so that was really a deep influence. I also, at the time when I was in college, as I mentioned, I was a religion major and, the apple fell far from the tree. But I hung out a lot in the religion department. I had some wonderful professors, and I'm very, very lucky that I'm still in touch with them. So after college, just to move us forward, I went to JTS for graduate school because I thought originally, like I went straight from undergrad to graduate school. And I thought that I wanted to become a PhD in Judaic studies and teach.
Mhm.
And I really realized after my first semester in grad school that that was not my path. But I stayed and finished a master's in Judaic studies. That was really the time when I started deepening my own personal observance in a traditional egalitarian context. And I learned so much in those 2.5 years that I was in grad school at the seminary that's really carried me. I mean, I just, the amount of out of the classroom learning just in like how to live a Jewish life and how to do mitzvot, like all of that was so really formative. And then I took a number of years off after grad school, and then I ended up, circuitously realizing that the rabbinate was where I was headed, and I went to rabbinical school again at JTS and finished in 2018.
Amazing. Okay, so you got your MA in Judaic Studies from JTS, then took a break
Mhm.
and came back for smicha. Okay,
Yes.
it seems sort of obvious from my perspective that you would become a rabbi, but was there a moment or a person who influenced you to make that decision? And if so, who was it and what happened?
One of the early impetuses for this path was that I found myself, in Jewish community. I was, had the master's in Judaic studies and was really involved and trying to figure out my way professionally. And bear in mind that I finished grad school in 2010. So that was a challenging time to be finishing grad school. Um, and I'm trying to find my way professionally. And I just had a strong sense and a strong like pull towards leadership, but it was really coming from a place of wanting to make lasting change in the Jewish community and feeling like being a rabbi, not only because of love of Torah and love of Judaism and love of all of the things, but also I thought it was going to help me kind of move communities that I was involved in towards greater accessibility and inclusion. And so that was an early impetus, but I would also say that I had a number of teachers, I always felt really drawn to the more contemplative, one of my closest friends, this happened the first semester of rabbinical school, but I'm going to answer the question with this anecdote here because I think it's really important. One of my closest friends to this day is somebody that I met when we were literally beginning. He was beginning cantorial school and I was beginning rabbinical school. We are still very, very, very close friends today. And I'll never forget, it was our first semester of seminary, and anybody who's gone through either rabbinical school or cantorial school or any kind of extensive program knows that there is a lot of stress involved. And this was back in 2013. And I remember, I'll never forget, he said to me, he's like, and I laughed, and he and I get a lot of joy out of this anecdote because of where I am now in my life. But he said to me, you might want to come with me to meditation. I think it could do you a lot of good. And my response to him at the time was like, "Are you kidding? Why on earth would I go and sit in silent? Like, how is that going to do anything for me? What is that going to do?" Like, and I went very reluctantly to this like meditation, and as you can see, I haven't done anything with it since.
I
Um,
love it.
that was a big impetus in for me in like really orienting the kind of rabbi that I want to be. And I find, when I was in rabbinical school, so much energy was focused on the doing and getting through school. And I know that many who may be listening can relate to this, where you tend to be so focused on your courses and your course load that sometimes the spirituality kind of got to the back burner, which was really sad for me. And in my second year of rabbinical school, I had the great fortune to connect with Jan Urbach, one of my dear teachers from JTS, who really tried to bring spirituality into the classes she taught. And that was a deep draw for me. And so I really and I learned a bunch with Dr. Eitan Fishbane. I learned a bunch with Rabbi Dr. Berkazatski. Like all of these people are and continue to be influences in my unfolding journey. And so that's, I think, all of those together, even though they all kind of came into my life like after I had been admitted to rabbinical school, one of the things that I try to remember is something that one of my colleagues, Rabbi Joel Zimmerman, taught me shortly after I got ordained, which is that there is the external curriculum. So, like the things you do in school, the courses, the internships, all the things. And then there's the internal curriculum, which is like all the spiritual work. And so that's, I think, for me, I got into the external piece, but then I was really able after, it got backburnered for a while, which was deeply sad for me. I was able to kind of recover that. And something that I've really cared about since graduation from medical school is really, really deeply recovering that piece of myself. So
Yeah, I love it. The external curriculum versus internal, and being in rabbinical school currently too, and having spent most of my life on my internal curriculum, it's like I have to make space, which I've always done, but you have to very intentionally do that because there's so much reading and there's so much academia involved, right? Which there should be, but I think that a healthy balance of that is essential because otherwise you just come out in your head and you missed
absolutely.
a
It's
lot of it.
it's extraordinarily essential. It really is. Yes, it's extremely essential. And I would say to anybody on this path that, as you just said, there's so much academia and there's so much learning. We are the people of the book, right? And we love our texts and we love our learning. And we have to remember to not only stay there, but to actually take it inward.
Nahum, absolutely. Okay, so for people watching this, I'm sure many people are fascinated by the technology of you going through school as a blind person and dealing with liturgy and Torah. Can you talk us a little bit about the technology and the fact that you're able to answer my text messages in real time? I'm always impressed by. You're actually faster than most people. I'd be really interested to hear about the technology.
Absolutely. Thank you for asking. So I would begin by saying that this is an always an ever-changing situation. Um, One of the things that I always say about accessibility is that it's iterative, things change all the time. So when I started rabbinical school, technology, like the access that I had was not nearly what it is today. And we're talking, I started rabbinical school in 2013. So just, I want folks to really pause and take that in. Like I'm only talking about 11 years ago,
Mm,
right? Roughly. So it was like fall of 2013. And at that time, we did not have in the Jewish community really a lot of resources. And I'm saying this as somebody who spent hours researching, right? So, of course, I could have missed something, but having spent hours, hours, and hours researching this, we did not have at that time a lot of freely, or I shouldn't say freely, easily accessible resources for somebody who wanted to be a rabbinical student who was a Braille reader, which I am, or uses a screen reader, which I do. And I'll describe both of those things. Um, a lot of it, I mean, and I say this to people and they're really shocked, but I feel like it's really important for me to be honest. I spent a lot of time in rabbinical school building my own library by necessity. That wasn't a choice. I didn't have another option. There were not organizations that were equipped at that time to actually support me. I was very, very lucky that I had teachers who, and partially this is because I had done the MA, partially who like they already knew me, some of them, which, even though it was a longer slog, if you consider the MA and the rabbinical school, it was 7.5 years of school with a bunch of years in the middle of break. For me, that's actually, I really believe now, what made rabbinical school even possible, because I came into the seminary already knowing a good number of the professors that I was going to be studying with. And if that had not been in place, I truly don't know that I would have made it through medical school. Like I honestly do not know that I would have. And I was very lucky that I had people who were invested in me as a person, which is not something I take for granted, unfortunately, but I think is something that all students deserve. And there were some extraordinary access challenges. One of the biggest ones, and this is still an access challenge, it's getting better, but I call myself, and I'll explain what I mean by this. I call myself a hyper majority user and a hyper minority user simultaneously. So, what do I mean by that? Assistive technology, by and large, is built for Western folks, built for English speakers, right? You can get, especially if you're a screen reader user, a screen reader is a software package that reads aloud text on a screen and it lets you interact with a computer. That's how I text. That's how I, here in this moment on this call. Um, and those technologies, there are several options out there and they're getting better all the time. And they entirely, again, this is my personal opinion. I speak for nobody but myself, right? But they assume an Anglo audience,
Mm-hmm.
right? So as an English speaker, I like everything is defaulted to me in that way. As somebody who works with Hebrew all the time, it is the exact opposite problem.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I mean by a hyper minority user, especially as somebody who doesn't live in Israel. It is a problem of like, oh, you wanted the Hebrew screen reader? Well, how are we going to get you one of those? I mean, we're talking 11 years ago, trying to get a Hebrew screen reader. It's much different now. Still not exactly where I want it to be, but it's much better than it was then because you would have to, like, I had to go through so many, let me try to put this thing together with this thing and see if this kind of works. And it usually didn't really work, and it sort of worked. And it was a real hubble, like it was a real challenge. Um, and that's the point where I want to talk about Hebrew Braille. So I am a Braille reader. I've been a Braille reader my entire life. And I, read Hebrew, English, Braille, both of them. And Hebrew Braille, a lot of people, because it's written from left to right, people think it's transliteration. It is not. It is the Aleph Bet in Braille characters. The reason that we read Hebrew from left to right is because Braille as a system of reading and writing was developed for Western languages. And I don't know why, but both Hebrew and Arabic ended up having to conform to that system. So often people will see me with a siddur or whatever, and they'll assume I'm reading transliteration, which I'm not reading transliteration. I'm reading Hebrew. I've had people say to me things like, which, luckily I don't get so many of these comments anymore, but I'll never forget the time I was in shul and somebody said, oh, well, I clearly knew you weren't reading transliteration because I was listening to how you were pronouncing the words and you were pronouncing them correctly. And I wish I had said to this person at the time, so you're focusing on my davening and not yours?
It's a funny compliment, yeah.
Or, it's a funny compliment. Or like, oh, wow, I was watching you daven. You were watching me daven, so you weren't focused on yours. And like, I didn't have the kind of guts to say that to people at the time, but I kind of wish I had. Like, mind your own davening. That's what I mean by being a hyper majority and minority user, which meant that in rabbinical school, the rabbinic texts, like the Talmud, for example, were extremely difficult. I was using things like Wikisource, if anybody even knows what that is anymore. Um, and like basic things that were available because things like the Art Scroll Shas was very much not available. The Steinsaltz was not. Getting a Vilna Shas, for those who aren't familiar, that is the way that the Talmud is traditionally printed without vocalization, without translation. It's the classical way folks learn, but then there are all these other editions of the Talmud. The point that I'm trying to make is that none of these things were easily accessible. So I would have to work with professors constantly on like building things. And it was very, very difficult. And I have found over the years that being direct about that is really important because I want people in our community to realize that these are really important things and that, we always have to ask ourselves, what do we assume another person wants or needs, right? A lot of the, organizations that tend to serve people with disabilities, I tend to, I kind of tend to think about like what do I think you need as opposed to what do you need, right? So really shifting from, you know, assuming what a person needs to like really working with them to get what they need.
I love it. It's a great frame of reference, right? Start with the other's frame of reference rather than what we think they need. And so now, one of my questions was in terms of reading Torah, in public, how do you do that? And walk us through that and kind of where is that at the moment with access?
Yeah, with access. So I'm going to try to make this as short as I can. So there are different opinions based on, because of course we're Jews, right? There are different opinions depending on where you are. Um, in my community, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards in 2003, so the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards is the conservative movement's halakhic decisors. They are the committee that creates shuvot or halakhic rulings for the movement. And the way that that works is that a rabbi in a pulpit, I am not a pulpit rabbi, so I'm mentioning that because it's relevant. Um, Rabbis who have pulpits are the ones that ultimately make the decision halakhically for their community, and the CJLS, which is the deciding body, kind of gives them guidance for that. So in 2003, there was a tshuva that was written by the dean of the rabbinical school when I was there, Rabbi Danny Nevins, answering the question, can a blind person read the Torah in public? And the long and short of it is the answer was no, except for in the case of a maftir, which the maftir is the verses that we say after we've read the entire portion, before we read the Haftarah in a synagogue setting on a Shabbat morning in a traditional setting. And the reason for that is because the rabbis meaning classically, were really very committed to the Torah being laned from the scroll itself. So if you are not physically able to lane, if you're not physically able to chant from the scroll, then you're not able to fulfill the congregational obligation to read Torah in public, which is an obligation on the community and not on the individual. The maftir, because the entire portion has been chanted, can be read from a Braille Chumash or, a Braille piece of paper that's written without vowels or punctuation, just like it would be in the Torah, but just in Braille. That was in 2003. That was, many, many years ago. I think that needs to be revisited. There's been a subsequent tshuva to that written by uh, an Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Elisa Sperling, who argues that actually, in fact, that a blind person can lean publicly from a Braille scroll, a Braille page. I'm not going to say a scroll, a Braille page, written without vowels, without punctuation, just as it would be in the Torah, and that there's a whole way in which that can happen. That is how I hold. That is my personal position. I believe it's very important for blind folks to feel like they're able to lead Torah in a way that can be acceptable and understood by the community. And there are also those in the community who there's someone who is trying to create a Braille Torah scroll,
I was going to
which
ask.
I have not yet experienced. But for those for whom a Braille Torah scroll would be totally fine in the context of their community, which I personally think it should be. There's a whole series of laws about scribing and how you write a Sefer Torah, like super important stuff that we take seriously, but I still think it's really important to ask questions about why and how. And so there are those who will lane directly from the scroll. Personally, I am someone who finds the idea of reading a Braille that's been rolled multiple times to be very challenging because Braille can often squish together. So my practice is in line with Rabbanit Sperling and her particular tshuva. Is my personal practice, and different people are going to have different ways on that, but that is the very short version. For people who are able to read large print, I think it's an easier question because often you can use magnification. The big challenge that I am still very much working with in my own internal landscape is there are many blind people for many reasons. I believe Braille is extremely important. I, personally believe it's the gateway to literacy. And I deeply understand that there are lots of people who, for lots of reasons, never learned Braille. Braille is difficult for them, like any number of reasons. And so, how do we include those folks in the opportunity to lane Torah? Because the rabbis really believe that laning from memory is not to be done because of mistakes. And so, we just want to be thinking about that. And that's a dynamic question that I'm thinking about a lot.
That was so interesting. There's so much there. Definitely rewind the tape and listen to all of it. There's a lot of depth and wisdom there, and it's fascinating to even think about the idea of a Braille Torah. It seems like there are more Siddurim that are Braille accessible. Is that the case? And if so, which ones? Just for point of reference.
Yeah, there are. And I'm actually very proud that I have been part of that process. Most recently, the conservative movement had a Siddur come out a while ago called Lev Shalem, which I helped to proofread and make accessible. So that is now accessible in Braille through JBI Library, which is in the Jewish world, probably the most well-known organization providing Braille access to Jewish text. Um, there are Siddurim available from every movement, including Orthodox, the Art Scroll Siddur. There's also Reconstructionist Siddurim and Reform Siddurim and Machzorim as well. I am aware that there are more Siddurim in process through JBI Library, which again is like the main organization doing this work. There is also an organization for those who are in the Haredi world. And I've actually gotten some stuff from them as well, which that's been a journey as well. It's been quite many years since I've been in touch with them, but they are out of Brooklyn and they're called CSB Care, I think is their new name, CSB Care. They provide a lot of religious text, particularly, as I said before, to the more Haredi among us.
It's good to have all of those resources. Let's transition a little bit here, and I'd like you to tell us about the focus of your work now, and tell people exactly what is the Ruach Rabbi in residence at Avodah.
Yeah, so for a number of years, I left that role in 2022, but for a number of years, I was a rabbi on staff at an organization called Avodah, the Jewish Service Corps. And that was an organization that worked with folks in their early 20s who were doing a year of service. And they, I believe, have a variety of locations around the United States where they invite Jewish young adults into a really intentional community where they're doing service learning, working at an organization um, supporting marginalized folks in the community. I know I had some students who were working in food banks. I had students who were working with people who were unhoused. I had students who were working with like literacy. I had students who were working in Jewish organizations doing this work on the ground. And so I was the rabbi who kind of worked with this very pluralistic group of folk who were seeking Jewish learning, and a lot of them, some of them were really connected Jewishly, and some of them really weren't. But I tried to be there for them. It was quite a journey because I started that right out of rabbinical school, and then I left in 2022. But in the intervening years, of course, we had the COVID-19 pandemic and everything moving to remote learning. It was quite a learning curve for myself and my students. So, yeah.
Okay, got it. And so, what do you have a position now, or are you or more independent?
Yeah. My primary work now, I am the program director and founder, and this is something I'm really proud of a program called Disability Wisdom as Soul Care. And I launched that program in partnership with one of my teachers and colleagues, Rabbi David Jaffe, who is the founder of an organization called Kirva. Disability Wisdom as Soul Care is part of Kirva. And this actually dovetails really well into the work that the focus of my work now, which is we are a program that really believes that there is deep Torah in the wisdom of disability experience, and there is deep wisdom in Torah that can relate to disability. And so we are creating a community of spiritual practice for Jews with disabilities who are also spiritual seekers, who really want to be able to bring their full selves into a Jewish spirituality focused space. And this really came out of my desire for this because, unfortunately, in many cases, a lot of religious communities and a lot of spiritual spaces, and yes, there's a lot of overlap. And, I don't love the way that those get broken down, but for the sake of this discussion, I'll kind of break it down a little bit. Um, are often not very accessible to people with disabilities, either because the folks facilitating don't have a lot of knowledge and or because also people are really carrying a lot of wounds from prior experience. And so, like, I will say in my own experience, when I'm teaching my students, right, I have to remember that a lot of them are beginning practitioners. And so I have to be really aware that, like, I was once in their place, and there are things that I find really supportive in my own practice that I am not necessarily going to bring to them immediately. Because if somebody had brought that to me immediately when I was starting on my path, I might have walked out the door,
Mm,
right? I have to be really sensitive to and just really in tune, right, with where my students are. And I miss that all the time because teachers do that. As our teacher, Dorothy Richmond, would say, imperfect teacher, perfect practice, right? And so this particular organization brings together in a very unique way Musar, which we translate as applied Jewish ethics, with Hasidut, which we at Kirva translate as applied Jewish mysticism, into an integrated spiritual path. So we're focused on right action in the world through Musar, through working on different soul traits, and we're focusing on the contemplative life through the Hasidut pieces. And I, in my own proclivities right now, very much am bringing the contemplative piece into my teaching.
okay.
So my students know that about me. They know that that's a big piece of this.
Okay, so that perfectly dovetails into my next question. I heard you say a very interesting definition of it for this organization, which is applied Jewish mysticism in a spiritual practice. Now, that's the first time I've ever heard it defined in that way. So, talk a little bit about a couple things, how you were introduced to Hasidism, what you love about it. Maybe you can even tell a short story of one of your favorite rabbis, and then, why it's morphed into this definition and what that actually means for you and your students.
Yeah, so I'll start at the beginning. I mean, I'll say that that definition is not mine, that is Rabbi Jaffe's. So I have my own little bit of Rashi on that definition, so to speak. Um, you Years and years and years ago, one of my rabbis, just like on a whim, we were like learning some Hasidut like over a decade ago. And I'll never forget this. I was like 24, 25, like very, very, like 15 years ago or something like that. And this rabbi said to me, he's like, I really think I'm going to give you this book, and I really suggest that you read it. And I think you're going to get a kick out of this. So here's a book I think you should read. It's called Holy Fire, Ish Kodesh. I really, really think you would enjoy this book. I think you would resonate with it deeply. And for those who aren't aware, the Ish Kodesh is also the Piasetzner the Rebbe. That's the name of his most famous book, but he wrote numerous books, known as the Rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto, Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira. Very beloved to me as a teacher. Of course, as our teacher, Rev James says, we never had the chance to meet. And I have so much more to learn, but there's a lot there for me that I am deeply grateful for in that teaching. So I would say, in terms of like a Rebbe, that I really find a lot of wisdom in. I'm very much not a looking for a Rebbe kind of person. I'm more of a looking for a teacher kind of person. So like I would say he's one of the people that I find a lot of wisdom in as a teacher, particularly because he was with the people in the worst moments and didn't abandon the people and was like teaching Torah from the depths of despair and the depths of hell. And so it feels to me like that Torah just becomes even more real and grounded because it's not, floating somewhere like, oh, I'm going to have this beautiful abstract concept. It's like, no, I'm giving these teachings over to my Hasidim who are literally in the depths of hell. And it just feels very real to the lived experience of being a human being. He was also a tremendous pedagogue, and really encouraged very holistic education, had a deep mindfulness practice, teaching that I particularly love, which I have a hard time applying, but a teaching that I love is the notion of, he talks about in one of his books, B'nai Machshava Tova, that when a person feels, a little bit of a stirring of the neshama, they might be having a difficult emotional experience, like what does that person do? They often want to turn towards the external because they don't want to deal with what's right here. They'll have a drink, they'll have a snack, they'll take a nap. Like these are all examples that he gives, right? Because we don't want to actually deal with what's right here. And how often do we? I know I do that all the time. I'm having something's arising, and rather than actually dealing with what's arising, I'm like, I don't want to deal with what's arising. I'm going to go do something else. And really opening ourselves up, that's teaching to really open ourselves up to that emotional terrain, so that we can actually get through it, right? So we can allow it to express itself and come through. And I find that very supportive. Um, I will say that I'm also very moved by Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who is one of the teachers of Rabbi David Jaffe, who I mentioned before as my colleague and founder of Kirva. One of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav's teachings, or practices, I should say, is Hitbodadut, which is talking aloud to God in your own words in a solitary place. And ideally out in nature, but wherever you can go. And that can be really transformative as well, to just kind of get it all out there. So those are two of many teachings. I also just love the idea that in general Hasidic teaching, that the divine is everywhere and everything. And the Me'orei Naim's teaching, the Chernobyl Rebbe, that the chiyut, the life force, is flowing through us, and that life force is ultimately Hakadosh Baruch Hu. And so remembering that every moment there is that vastness, that we're part of something wider than we are, which in moments of great difficulty can be helpful as a reminder when we can feel into that. And so to end, I'll say, I don't know how Rabbi Jaffe came to define in this context Hasidut as applied Jewish mysticism, but I think the idea is that we don't just think of Hasidut as this solitary thing that we do, or this, I've had teachers who were not at all into Hasidut say, and I think that there's some truth to this, right? I've had some teachers in my past who were deeply not into Hasidut and say, Hasidut is escapism, is escapism. And what I would say in response to that is anyone who has really sat with Hasidut in a very serious way, and I want to just backtrack and say, when I say Hasidut, I'm speaking about the literature of Hasidut and the teachings. If people have sat with that, it's really hard to think of that as escapism. And in our modern world, any spiritual lineage, any tool can be used as a bypass, right? We talk about this a lot in spiritual practice, right? We don't want to engage in spiritual bypass, which is basically using spirituality as a way of avoiding the real world we actually live in. But instead, and I think this is what's meant by applied, taking spiritual practice and bringing it into our lives in every way, not just when we're formally practicing, but also when we're informally practicing.
Yes, 100%. And I think that, using the definition of applied Jewish mysticism absolutely applies to the Piazetzner Rebbe, who was there in process. And yeah, I absolutely 100% disagree with Hasidut as escapism, because the whole idea of Judaism is tikkun olam, is transforming the world as a result of, from my perspective, having transformed ourselves and having been through not bypassing our emotions and our midot and things of that nature, and for students and whatnot. But you got to start at home and then move out into the world, right? And there is the Retzov and the Shuv. There's the journey, there's the ascent, but then there's the return into the world. As opposed to, there are some other mystical or ascetic practices where it's not about the return. We're just going to go in a one directional, which usually doesn't end well, right? Coming back into the community to bring the gifts and to uplift and elevate and transform the world is absolutely essential to Chassidut, which is one of the many reasons that why I love it. So as we're wrapping up here, I want to share a famous Helen Keller quote, which I'm sure you know, which is the only thing worse than being blind is having sight but no vision. And so I want to
Mm.
ask you about your vision for yourself moving forward.
I would say moving forward, I feel a very, very deep call to bringing contemplative Jewish practice into the wider Jewish community. I think all the time about how we're part of these spaces, right? You and I, and lots of different ways over the last couple of years, have been part of these spaces that are really committed to this practice. And I feel very full. But then I am outside of those spaces and I'm in my actual life in the world. And I meet so many of our people who have no idea that any of this is out there. It's not that we're not trying to get it out there, but a lot of our people have no idea. And I really believe that we are at a time in our history as a people for so many reasons that we need to focus on practice to be the best people we can be for ourselves, for each other, and the world. And that it's not enough, right? I was very much trained in a model of learning that's known as Wissenschaft des Judentums, which is, I think, German. I don't have German, but I think it's German, um, meaning the science of Judaism, right? It was this 19th century idea that if we were to be respectable as Jews, right, how do we do that? We bring our learning into the university. I'm glad we brought a lot of our learning into the university. I'm grateful for that. It covers lots of really important things that should not be underestimated, right? I think we should continue to do that. I think it's very important. And I think that we need to also remember that it's not only about information externally, but it's about how we change our lives and souls. And I would love to be part of a Jewish Renaissance that's really about soulfulness. And I think it's hard for people to get there. And so I want to find ways to kind of work with people to kind of get past a lot of those inhibitions that we have been conditioned into. Like, oh, we Jews don't do that. It's not a thing that Jews do. Jews don't engage in devotional practice, right? Jews don't, engage in meditation. That's not a Jewish thing to do. Jews don't chant. Well, I know plenty of Jews who do all of those things, right? And I'm one of them. And so let's like bring that into the wider world. That is what I really want to do with my life going forward.
I love it. Gamani, meaning me too. Okay, but one term that you threw out there, we'll have to look up the German term, but in terms of, you say practice, right? And this is the term that we throw around in meditation communities, referring to the meditation practice. But I think, Lauren, you were using it in terms of one spiritual practice. Unpack that term a little bit so people have a better context for how you are using that.
Yeah, I would say all of the above. In meditation communities, we do use it a lot to refer to the practice of meditation, but also practice of just Judaism as practice, right? That Judaism is a path of deep spiritual practice. And we often, I mean, at least the way I was brought into religious community, that is not at all the orientation I was taught. The orientation I was taught was like Judaism is mitzvot, mitzvot are the way that we do halakha, and God is in there somewhere. I mean, like there's something about the divine there, but like the emphasis is very much on halakha as like thing to aspire to, when actually halakha is part and parcel of walking with the divine. Like that's the entire root of the term halakha is to walk, to go. It's a practice, it's a path. So really allowing ourselves to not do things in a rote way, but to really bring the heart space and the head space together and to give ourselves permission to be vulnerable in that way and to not only stay in the headspace, which is a very safe space for me to be, by the way, to really get out of there and to have to really be with the body because the body is all involved in Jewish practice in so many ways. And like practice is so many things, and our tradition is rich in that way. And so that's what I mean by practice is that Judaism isn't just in the mind, it's a way of life.
Nachon, absolutely. There's this beautiful writing by Chaim Bialik, who, and I'm loosely quoting here, refers to halacha as the spiritual practice of refining the soul, right? Which is a
Hmm.
gorgeous way of thinking about it. And he writes very poetically. So I encourage you to check out his writings, early 20th century writer. We have much more to talk about, Lauren, and I want to honor your time. And I know that the time is coming to a close here, but I want to ask two final questions, which is, do you have any projects or anything that you're working on right now coming out, or something that is timely that you'd like people to know about?
Yes, I want to invite folks to check me out. I have a Substack now called Contemplative Torah, which is Contemplative Torah, one word, .substack.com. A lot of my work is there, so I really want to invite folks to check that out. That's a pretty big project I'm working on, putting more out there and up there. And I also, as I mentioned, I founded Disability Wisdom is Soul Care. So the next time we open up applications for the next round, which will probably be sometime later this spring, summer, people are super encouraged to look into that as well. So those are two projects that I wanted to name.
Great. And also, you travel either by Zoom or in person to communities and do scholar in residence works. Do you still do that?
Yes, that is true. Thank you for asking about that. Yes, I am available for virtual and in-person scholar in residence throughout the year. And if you are interested in that, you can contact me through my website, which we can put in the show notes, rabbituchman.com. And there's a page there that says bring me to your community, and you can contact me there and we can make it happen.
Amazing. Okay. So, Rabbi Tuchman, thank you for your time. First of all, I know you are a woman in demand. There's a lot of things that you're doing and a lot of amazing work you have to do in the world. And I'm going to end with the question that I ask every guest on the Holy Sparks podcast, which is this: what does the Jewish world need now most, and why?
Nikunim. I mean that very seriously.
Okay, you have to translate.
Uh, Nikun is a wordless melody. And it goes back to what I said about practice. We need spaces where we can just envelope ourselves in practice and just be in that space of being able to be with other. I mean, I recently was at a Nigun circle and just being there with the Reza ensemble, which was amazing to hear in person, was just like so what we need. We need to tend our souls. We spend so much time like worrying about all these things, and a lot of them are just beyond our individual control. Not that they aren't important. We should be acting skillfully in the world. Anybody who knows me knows that I deeply believe that. But we've neglected our neshamas, and we need to do something about that.
I love it. What a great response. And so, Lauren, I always want to end with a blessing, which that Hashem should bless you to expand your reach of people that need you and are seeking you and your services, but to people in our community that need more access to the wisdom and through a variety of stumbling blocks, be it personal, spiritual, emotional, or disabilities, have lack of access to this deep treasure chest that is our wisdom, and that you're able to find the communities that need you and can learn from you, and that in your embodied practice and contemplative practice, you allow people the gateway into this, as I mentioned, treasure chest, right? Caring for the soul, caring for the neshama, and that you can be a gesher for people to achieve that. And I'm very grateful to know you, and I'm honored to have you on the podcast. And I want to wish you a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom to you as well, Saul. It was a real pleasure and honor to be with you today and be on the podcast. And I really hope that this conversation that we've had together will be of benefit to all who hear it.
Amen. Ken here at Zone, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Holy Sparks podcast.